Standing before the towering walls of Neuschwanstein Castle or the rugged battlements of Dover Castle, it's easy to get lost in their grandeur, the sheer scale, the intricate details, the sense of history frozen in stone. But have you ever stopped to wonder what it truly took to bring these colossal structures to life? Behind every soaring turret and fortified wall lies a story far more dramatic than the castles themselves, a tale of unimaginable expense, back-breaking labor, and sacrifices that spanned generations. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on Europe's greatest castles to reveal the hidden economics of medieval ambition. This isn't just a story of kings and queens. It's a story of thousands of unnamed workers, fortunes spent on materials hauled from distant lands, and political gambles that could bankrupt entire realms. Picture this. A single stone in a castle wall might represent a week's wages for a skilled laborer, or the life savings of a peasant family taxed to fund the project. The timber for scaffolding, harvested from forests miles away, transported by oxen that would never see home again, and the sheer human cost workers risking their lives on precarious scaffolding, artisans shaping stone by hand for years, entire communities displaced to make way for a monarch's vision. These castles weren't just built, they were bought with blood, sweat, and gold. Yet for all their splendor, their true cost often went unrecorded, buried beneath legends of chivalry and conquest. What if I told you that some of these castles nearly bankrupted the very kingdoms they were meant to protect? Or that the construction of a single fortress could consume more resources than an entire town's yearly harvest? This is the untold story of medieval Europe's most iconic landmarks, not as static relics of the past, but as living testaments to the extremes of human ambition. By the time we're done, you'll never look at a castle the same way again. So let's step beyond the postcard-perfect facades and into the gritty, awe-inspiring reality of what it took to build Europe's greatest castles. The journey begins now. To understand why castles became the ultimate status symbol of medieval Europe, we have to step into the turbulent world of the 11th century, a time when borders shifted like sand and power was measured in stone and mortar. Imagine a landscape where a local lord's authority extended only as far as his soldiers could march in a day. In this fractured world, castles weren't just defensive strongholds. They were billboards advertising a ruler's strength, designed to intimidate rivals and reassure allies. Every towering keep sent a clear message: cross me, and you'll face walls thicker than your ambitions. But the castle-building frenzy wasn't just about brute force. It was a calculated game of political chess. Take the Norman conquest of England in 1066. William the Conqueror didn't just bring an army, he brought a blueprint for domination. Within years, wooden motte and bailey forts mushroomed across the countryside, each one a foothold of Norman control in hostile territory. These early castles were quick to build but potent in their symbolism, transforming conquered land into a network of power. And as tensions flared between kingdoms, the designs grew more sophisticated. By the 12th century, concentric walls and arrow slits turned castles into near impenetrable fortresses, sparking an arms race where every new innovation was quickly copied or surpassed. Yet the most surprising truth, many of these castles were never tested in battle. Their mere presence was often enough to deter rebellion or invasion, making them the ultimate medieval bluff. The Dukes of Burgundy, for example, built lavish palaces within their fortress walls, using art and architecture to project wealth as much as military might. A castle's grandeur could secure alliances through marriage negotiations or visiting diplomats, proving that sometimes the strongest weapon wasn't a trebuchet, but a throne room dripping in gold leaf. Behind this architectural one-upmanship lay a darker reality. The cost of failure was catastrophic. When King Edward I of Wales pushed his ring of iron castles into Welsh territory, he wasn't just building defenses, he was erasing a culture. Each new fortress displaced local rulers, reshaped trade routes, and drained resources from the land. And for every success story like Edward's, there were disasters like Shétau Gaillard, Richard the Lionheart's impregnable masterpiece that fell in just 6 months, bankrupting his successors. The irony, the very castles meant to ensure stability often fueled the conflicts they were built to withstand, as rival lords scrambled to outbuild each other. So the next time you see a castle silhouetted against the sky, remember, those stones weren't just laid by masons, but by the tides of history itself, a tangible echo of an age when power wasn't just held, but carved into the earth for all to see. The true architects of Europe's castles weren't the kings who commissioned them, but the countless hands that shaped every stone. While history remembers the rulers, the laborers, peasants, serfs, and craftsmen remained invisible, their stories etched not in parchment but in the very walls they built. Take Shétau de Coucy, where records show entire villages were emptied during construction seasons, with every able-bodied man and woman pressed into service. This wasn't volunteer work, it was a feudal obligation, a tax paid not in coin but in backbreaking labor. Imagine the scene, hundreds of workers toiling from dawn till dusk, hauling limestone blocks weighing as much as 2 oxen. The skilled masons, some traveling from as far as Italy, commanded better wages, but even their pay barely covered the years spent perched on wooden scaffolds, chiseling intricate details into unforgiving stone. For the unskilled majority, life was harsher still. Serfs transported materials along muddy tracks, their carts sinking under the weight of timber dragged from forests 50 miles away. Accidents were commonplace: crushed limbs, falls from dizzying heights, exhaustion that claimed lives with little more than a shrug from overseers. What makes this system even more striking is how it functioned like a medieval assembly line. Quarrymen worked in teams to extract stone, blacksmiths forged tools on site, and carpenters built the elaborate scaffolding that rose with the walls. At Beaumaris Castle in Wales, records show over 2,000 workers employed at the project's peak, a staggering number for the 13th century. Yet for all this coordination, the human cost remained shockingly disposable. When a wall collapsed at Crac des Chevaliers, burying dozens, the incident warranted just 2 lines in a ledger alongside notes about mortar supplies. The craftsmen's contributions were equally vital but far more precarious. Master stonemasons signed contracts that bound them for years, often with clauses punishing slow work with withheld pay. Their expertise came at a price. At Malbork Castle, Polish masons developed curved brick techniques so demanding that many suffered permanent spinal damage from crouching over kilns. Even the prestigious title of Master Builder offered little security. If a lord ran out of funds, as often happened, these artisans could wait decades for promised wages. Perhaps most haunting are the traces these workers left behind. At Dover Castle, faint scratches on stones reveal where masons marked their pieces for payment, while graffiti in hidden chambers shows crude sketches of faces, likely the only memorials these men would ever receive. These silent testimonies remind us that behind every soaring arch was a lifetime of sacrifice, every fortified gate purchased with someone's youth. As we turn next to the materials that made these dreams possible, remember, the real foundation of any castle wasn't stone or mortar, but the generations of ordinary people who gave everything to build the extraordinary. Stone didn't just appear at the castle walls. It was wrestled from the earth through a grueling process that tested medieval engineering to its limits. Consider the quarries of Keene in Normandy, where workers toiled in open pits to extract the creamy limestone that built everything from the Tower of London to Westminster Abbey. These weren't small operations. Some quarries stretched over hundreds of acres, their depths plunging far below the water table. Teams of men worked in rotating shifts, using iron wedges and hammers to split stone along natural faults, while boys as young as 12 hauled away debris. Every block was a gamble. Too much force could fracture precious material, while too little meant days of wasted effort. Transporting these monoliths was where the real nightmare began. A single block for cracked chevaliers might weigh as much as 2 tons, requiring a team of oxen to drag it along rutted paths in dry weather or through knee-deep mud after rains. Records from Burgundy show that moving stone just 20 miles could take longer than the actual quarrying, with carts needing constant repairs and animals dropping from exhaustion. The financial toll was staggering. At Château de Pierrefonds, accounts reveal that transporting stone from nearby forests cost more than the wages of all the masons combined. And when castles rose in remote locations, like the cliffside fortress of Mont Saint-Michel, builders resorted to tidal bridges, wooden causeways that only appeared at low tide, turning the very sea into a makeshift road. But the most shocking expense lay in the waste. Nearly a third of quarried stone never made it into walls, shattered during transport or rejected by perfectionist masons. At Malbork Castle, builders compensated by developing revolutionary brick-making techniques, baking local clay into durable blocks that could be produced on site. This innovation spared them the back-breaking logistics of stone transport, but came with its own hidden costs. Forests were cleared for kiln fuel, and the constant smoke turned the air toxic for nearby villages. What emerges from these accounts isn't just a story of material scarcity, but of desperate ingenuity. When Duke Philip the Bold constructed his palace in Dijon, he didn't just buy stone, he bought entire quarries, monopolizing supply chains to starve rival projects. Lesser nobles, unable to compete, often resorted to castle fakery, effacing only the visible walls in fine stone while filling interiors with rubble. The true measure of a medieval ruler's power wasn't just the height of his towers, but his ability to bend geography itself to his will, turning distant mountains into conquered walls, one back-breaking wagon load at a time. Timber might seem like a humble material compared to stone, but in medieval Europe it was as precious as gold, and just as hard to secure. Picture entire forests vanishing to feed the insatiable appetite of castle construction. A single great hall's roof could swallow hundreds of oak trees, each one requiring decades to mature. By the 13th century, regions like England faced such severe deforestation that kings imposed strict laws protecting remaining woodlands, punishing illegal logging with fines or even mutilation. Yet the demand only grew. When Henry III rebuilt Windsor Castle's roof, his carpenters had to source timber from as far as Norway, paying exorbitant prices for beams shipped across treacherous seas. Iron was even more critical and more problematic. Without it, gates wouldn't swing, portcullises wouldn't drop, and doors wouldn't lock. But producing iron required vast quantities of charcoal, which meant more trees felled and burned. Blacksmiths became the rock stars of their day, commanding wages that dwarfed those of soldiers. A single hinge for a castle gate could cost as much as a peasant's yearly rent, and nails were so valuable they were often salvaged from demolished buildings. The siege of Rochester Castle laid bare this desperation. When King John needed to collapse its towers in 1215, He didn't just order more stones, he demanded 40 pigs of iron be hauled across England to forge the tools that would undo its defenses. This scarcity sparked ingenious workarounds. At Conway Castle, builders mixed scarce iron with cheaper lead to create reinforced joints, while French architects developed false beams, plaster-coated timber frames that mimicked the look of solid oak at a fraction of the cost. Some lords even resorted to recycling, like the Duke of Brittany, who dismantled an old monastery to repurpose its roof for his fortress. But perhaps the most telling innovation came from the Teutonic Knights at Malbork. When iron shortages threatened their expansion, they switched to brick vaulting supported by hidden iron rods, a medieval version of reinforced concrete. Behind every solution, though, lurked a darker truth. The quest for materials didn't just drain treasuries, it reshaped landscapes and lives. Villages near iron mines choked on charcoal fumes, while rivers ran brown with sawdust from floating timber mills. And when resources ran dry, construction didn't stop, it just became more brutal. Records from Burgundy show peasants ordered to surrender their door hinges for castle gates, leaving homes unprotected. The greatest castles of Europe didn't just rise on stone and timber. They were built on borrowed time, their splendor masking a continent-wide scramble for vanishing resources. This relentless demand set the stage for the era's true unsung heroes, the artisans who turned scarcity into opportunity. Their story begins not in quarries or forests, but in smoky forges and cramped workshops, where skill met necessity to redefine what castles could be. The master builders of medieval Europe were more than architects. They were the rock stars of their age, commanding salaries that rivaled noblemen and living under the constant threat of kidnapping by rival lords. Take James of St. George, the Swiss-born genius behind Edward I's iron ring of Welsh castles. His contracts weren't just about wages, they included armed escorts to prevent rivals from spiriting him away. This wasn't paranoia when the Duke of Burgundy lost his master builder to a rival. Construction on his half-finished castle stalled for 20 years. These men weren't merely drawing plans, they held the keys to kingdoms in their minds. What set them apart was a rare fusion of skills. A true master builder had to be part mathematician, part general, and part artist. When designing concentric walls at Beaumaris Castle, James didn't just calculate thickness, he predicted how attackers might exploit shadows at dawn or how winter ice could weaken mortar. Their notebooks reveal astonishing details: the ideal angle for arrow slits to maximize archer coverage, how to curve staircases clockwise to disadvantage right-handed invaders, even recipes for mortar that could withstand decades of rain. This knowledge was so valuable that many builders encrypted their notes, fearing rivals might steal their techniques. The most successful master builders operated like medieval CEOs. Villard de Honnecourt, whose sketchbook survives today, didn't just design cathedrals, he managed international teams of masons, negotiated timber shipments, and even pioneered early quality control systems. At Carcassonne, builders used numbered stones to track workmanship, allowing them to deduct wages for sloppy craftsmanship. Their contracts often included performance bonuses. The builder of Château de Vincennes received extra payment when his innovative ribbed vaults passed a strength test involving 30 armored knights jumping simultaneously. Yet for all their prestige, these men walked a razor's edge. When Richard the Lionheart's pet project Château au Gaillard fell unexpectedly in 1204, its builder disappeared from records likely executed for the embarrassment. Other failures carried less brutal but equally devastating consequences. Master Walter of Hereford, after miscalculating the foundation depth at Caerphilly Castle, saw his reputation ruined when the southeast tower began sinking during construction. The difference between legend and disgrace often came down to inches or the whims of impatient patrons. This volatile world of castle construction set the stage for its most dramatic cost driver, warfare. As siege technology evolved from wooden towers to gunpowder cannons, each new threat forced architects back to the drawing board, sending budgets spiraling out of control. The very walls meant to guarantee security became financial liabilities, demanding constant upgrades in an endless arms race against destruction. Siege warfare didn't just test castle walls, it shattered royal budgets with every thrown boulder and flaming arrow. The moment a new fortress rose from the ground, engineers across Europe were already scheming ways to tear it down, sparking an arms race that turned castles into financial sinkholes. Take Beaumaris Castle's famed concentric walls. Those graceful rings of defense cost Edward I nearly £15,000 in the late 13th century, a sum that could have fed an entire county for years. Yet within decades, even this engineering marvel became vulnerable to improved trebuchets capable of hurling 300-pound stones with terrifying accuracy. The true expense lay in the constant upgrades. When gunpowder arrived in the 14th century, builders scrambled to reinforce walls with earthworks to absorb cannon fire, adding layers of expense nobody had anticipated. At Raglan Castle, the Earl spent his family's fortune thickening walls by 12 feet after seeing what early cannons did to neighboring fortresses. But these weren't one-time costs. Garrisons had to be maintained year-round, with payrolls stretching into thousands of pounds annually just for basic staffing. Records from Dover Castle show its peacetime garrison devouring 2,000 pounds of cheese and 4,000 gallons of beer each month, all while armorers worked overtime repairing rusted chainmail and blunted swords. Siege damage inflicted its own financial nightmares. After the brutal assault on Rochester Castle in 1215, repairs cost King Henry III over £1,200 more than the original construction budget. Worse still were the hidden expenses. When Château Gaillard fell to the French in 1204, its loss wasn't just military but psychological, triggering panic investments in upgrades across English-held territories. Lords found themselves trapped in a vicious cycle. The more they spent on defense, the more tempting their wealth became for attackers, guaranteeing future sieges. Some rulers attempted radical cost-cutting measures with disastrous results. The Duke of Burgundy tried replacing skilled archers with cheaper crossbowmen, only to discover their slower reload time left walls vulnerable. Others, like the Count of Flanders, skimped on mortar quality during expansions, leading to collapsed towers that cost triple to rebuild. The bitter irony. Many castles bankrupted their owners without ever seeing battle. Their mere existence drew attacks like moths to a flame, while peacetime maintenance alone could drain a treasury dry. What finally broke this unsustainable system wasn't military defeat, but simple economics. By the 15th century, the cost of maintaining a state-of-the-art fortress equaled the entire annual revenue of a mid-sized kingdom. Kings faced an impossible choice: pour endless resources into outdated stone giants, or abandon them to focus on mobile armies. The rise of professional standing armies didn't make castles obsolete overnight, but it did reveal their greatest vulnerability. No matter how thick the walls, no fortress could withstand the crushing weight of its own expense. The staggering cost of castle construction didn't vanish into thin air. It was extracted coin by coin and hour by hour from the people who could least afford it. Feudal lords wielded taxation like a blunt instrument, turning entire villages into human ATMs to fund their architectural ambitions. England's pipe rolls, those meticulous medieval tax records, paint a chilling picture. Under Henry II, nearly a third of all royal revenue was funneled into castle building, with peasants paying not just in silver pennies but in backbreaking labor. A farmer might owe 40 days of work annually hauling stones, while his wife spun wool to furnish the Lord's chambers. Even children weren't spared, gathering firewood to feed the endless kilns baking mortar. The system operated on a brutal calculus of coercion. In France, the corvée, a legal obligation of unpaid labor, stretched from weeks to years as projects fell behind schedule. At Château de Chinon, records show entire families marched to work under armed guard after failing to meet quotas. But the most insidious levies were the arbitrary castle taxes, sudden demands for extra funds when budgets exploded. In 1285, the burghers of Rothenburg revolted when their bishop demanded a second round of taxes to repair his crumbling fortress, screaming through the streets that God made men, not castles. Resistance simmered beneath the surface until it boiled over. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 wasn't just about poll taxes, it was a fiery backlash against generations of construction bondage. Rebel leader Wat Tyler made demolition a priority, targeting royal castles as symbols of oppression. At Rochester, insurgents didn't just loot the treasury, they methodically dismantled the gatehouse stone by stone, a literal deconstruction of feudal power. Similar uprisings erupted across Europe. Flemish weavers torched counts' castles in 1302, while Spanish villagers poisoned oxen teams hauling stone in 1423. Yet the cruelest irony lay in how these projects backfired economically. While castles promised security, their construction often destabilized the very regions they were meant to control. Fields left untended during labor levies led to famines, as seen in Normandy's hungry winter of 1316 after stone hauling diverted farmers from harvests. Trade routes withered under tolls imposed to fund construction. The Rhine Valley saw a 30% drop in merchant traffic during major castle builds. Even successful fortresses became white elephants. Maintenance costs for Chepstow Castle consumed 80% of its lord's annual income by 1400, forcing him to sell off villages just to keep the gates hinged. These crumbling ledgers reveal a truth far darker than any dungeon. Europe's greatest castles weren't triumphs of engineering, but monuments to inequality. Every arrow loop was paid for in missed meals, every turret raised on the stooped backs of people who'd never cross its threshold unless dragging a load of stone. As we turn next to the psychological toll of these projects, remember, the real walls weren't made of limestone, but of broken promises and stolen futures. When we think of medieval castles, images of armored knights and feudal lords usually come to mind, but some of Europe's most formidable fortresses were built not by kings, but by bishops. The church wasn't just a spiritual authority, it was a military powerhouse with its own armies, tax systems, and territorial ambitions. Take Avignon's papal palace, a soaring complex of towers and battlements that served as both holy seat and impregnable stronghold during the 14th century. Its construction swallowed 2/3 of the papacy's annual income for nearly 30 years, funded by tithes collected from every corner of Christendom. This wasn't just architecture, it was divine power made manifest in stone. The Teutonic Knights took this fusion of faith and force to even greater extremes. Their sprawling Malbork Castle in Poland, still the largest brick fortress ever built, was financed by crusading taxes and plunder from Baltic campaigns. What made these ecclesiastical castles different wasn't just their funding, but their dual purpose. Bishops' palaces like Durham Castle in England featured chapels with arrow slits, where priests could celebrate Mass while archers defended the walls. At Albi in southern France, the cathedral itself became the fortress, its walls thick enough to withstand siege engines while its interior glowed with religious frescoes. These weren't contradictions to medieval minds, but natural extensions of God's will, protection for the faithful and punishment for the wicked, all in one mighty structure. Yet even holy projects faced earthly consequences. When Bishop Henry of Winchester diverted alms meant for London's poor to build Wolvesey Castle in the 12th century, riots erupted outside his half-finished walls. Peasants starved while wagons loaded with stained glass rumbled past, sparking sermons accusing the clergy of building their way to heaven on empty bellies. The backlash grew so fierce that Pope Innocent III eventually banned bishops from military construction without papal approval, a rule many conveniently ignored. The greatest irony, many church-built castles became targets precisely because of their wealth. During the 100 Years' War, English troops specifically targeted episcopal fortresses like Beaucaire Castle, knowing their vaults held not just relics, but the collected tithes of entire dioceses. As these holy fortresses crumbled under cannon fire, they revealed the uncomfortable truth. When faith becomes too entangled with fortifications, even the mightiest walls can't protect against the wrath of those left outside them. The towering walls of Edward I's Welsh castles weren't just barriers, they were psychological warfare carved in stone. Caernarfon's polygonal towers, modeled after Constantinople's mighty Theodosian walls, sent an unmistakable message. This wasn't just conquest, it was civilization itself being rewritten. Yet the dirty secret hidden behind those imposing facades, most of these fortresses saw less combat than a village watchtower. Their real battles were fought not with swords, but with symbolism, every crenellation a propaganda piece, every gatehouse a stage for carefully choreographed displays of power. Consider the curious case of Harlech Castle. Built at staggering expense on a cliff overlooking the Irish Sea, its military usefulness was questionable. Local Welsh tribes lacked siege engines anyway. But when Edward hosted foreign dignitaries in its Great Hall, the effect was electric. Visitors wrote home describing a mountain made by human hands, their reports magnifying England's reputation across Europe. The castle became what modern strategists would call a force multiplier. Its mere existence made rebellions less likely, saving the crown countless military campaigns. Similar psychological games played out across the continent. The Holy Roman Emperor's octagonal castle del Monte contained no dungeons or barracks, just exquisite mathematical precision designed to awe visitors into submission. This propaganda arms race had dangerous consequences for rulers who misjudged their audience. The Dukes of Burgundy learned this the hard way with their extravagant palace fortresses in Dijon. While intended to showcase wealth, the gold leaf gates and jeweled tapestries only inflamed peasant resentment during grain shortages. More disastrous still was Louis II of Hungary's Visegrad Palace, whose Italianate luxury so offended his nobles that they withheld troops during the Ottoman invasions. These weren't just architectural missteps, they were fatal misreadings of how power truly worked in the medieval mind. The greatest illusion of all, many impenetrable castles were secretly vulnerable. Richard the Lionheart's Château au Gaylord fell in months despite its revolutionary design, while the supposedly unconquerable Crac des Chevaliers surrendered after a forged letter tricked its defenders. Yet even in failure, the myth often outlived the reality. When Caernarfon's walls proved too thin to withstand Welsh longbow fire, Edward simply had artists repaint the damage in official portraits, preserving the fiction of invincibility. What emerges from these stones isn't a story of military engineering, but of human psychology weaponized at continental scale. The true masters of castle building understood something deeper than masonry. Sometimes the most powerful walls are the ones that exist in the minds of your enemies. Bankruptcy wasn't just a risk in medieval castle building, it was practically baked into the stonework. Take the case of Pierrefonds Castle, where Duke Louis of Orleans nearly crippled France's economy in his quest to outshine the king. Originally budgeted at 40,000 livres, costs ballooned to over 200,000, equivalent to 5 years' royal revenue, as craftsmen added unnecessary flourishes like gilded ceiling beams and a moat lined with imported marble. The project became such a financial black hole that workers staged Europe's first recorded construction strike when payments stopped, abandoning tools mid-wall. Spain's Laura Castle tells an even starker tale of ambition outpacing reality. Built to secure Aragon's frontier against Islamic forces, its isolated mountaintop location sent costs spiraling. Accounts show 1 in 4 supply wagons never made it up the treacherous paths, their oxen succumbing to exhaustion while precious iron fittings tumbled into ravines. King Sancho III was forced to levy emergency taxes on Jewish and Moorish communities, sparking revolts that diverted military resources from the very borders Laura was meant to protect. Within decades, this strategic masterpiece stood half-empty, its garrison reduced to skeleton crews because the kingdom could no longer afford to staff it. Comparing regional costs reveals surprising patterns. In England, Edward I's Welsh castles averaged £3,000 each, a fortune at the time, but modest compared to Burgundy's Château de Germals, where just the stained glass cost 8,000 gold florins. The difference: English castles prioritized function over form, while continental rulers treated them as vanity projects. Records from Florence show the Medici spending more on a single fresco cycle at Cafaggiolo Castle than the entire annual budget of Venetian naval defenses. The real fiscal vampires were maintenance costs. While initial construction might bankrupt a treasury, keeping a castle operational could drain generations. Heating Dover Castle's Great Hall required 600 acres of forest annually, while Malbork's Teutonic Knights needed 2,000 peasants just to prevent its brick walls from crumbling. Some rulers resorted to desperate measures. The Count of Savoy rented out his castle's towers as grain silos, while the Duke of Brittany turned his ramparts into paid parking for merchant caravans. What emerges from these crumbling ledgers is a universal truth. Whether in Wales or Wallachia, castles weren't just military tools but mirrors reflecting their builders' fiscal wisdom or folly. The stones still standing today aren't merely ruins. They're the skeletal remains of budgets pushed beyond breaking point, silent witnesses to the day when even kings had to face the accountant's reckoning. Geography wasn't just a backdrop for castle construction. It was the invisible hand that could double a budget or bankrupt a builder overnight. Take the stark contrast between Germany's Eltz Castle, clinging to its rocky pinnacle, and England's Bodiam Castle, rising from marshland like a mirage. Eltz's builders faced a nightmare of precision. Every stone had to be winched up 300 feet of cliff face, with foundations carved directly into the living rock. The cost, nearly 40% more than a flatland fortress of similar size. Yet Bodiam's builders paid a different price. Their cheap marsh site required thousands of oak pilings driven deep into the soggy earth, plus a network of hidden channels to prevent the entire structure from sinking into the muck. What looked like a simple choice of location became a lifetime of engineering headaches. Eastern Europe's brick castles reveal another surprising twist of economics. While Western lords bankrupted themselves quarrying limestone, the Teutonic Knights at Malbork Castle exploited the Baltic's clay-rich soil to create something revolutionary: a fortress of fire-baked bricks. These modular blocks could be produced on site by unskilled laborers, cutting transport costs to near zero. A single brick tower at Malbork cost less than half its stone equivalent in France, yet withstood sieges just as effectively. The trade-off: Constant maintenance brick absorbed moisture, requiring armies of workers to replaster walls before winter frosts could crack them apart. Climate played its own cruel tricks on budgets. Mediterranean castles like Carcassonne baked under relentless sun, their mortar drying too fast unless mixed with expensive egg whites as a retardant. Meanwhile, Scottish castles like Stirling battled horizontal rain that seeped into arrow slits, requiring intricate lead flashings and sloping windowsills that added months to construction timelines. Some solutions bordered on the absurd when fog regularly blinded sentries at Portugal's Sintra Castle. Builders installed a network of polished bronze mirrors to reflect torchlight, a dazzling expense that yielded more spectacle than security. The true masters of adaptation were the Crusader states, where European ideals collided with Middle Eastern realities. At Crac des Chevaliers, Frankish engineers combined local gypsum mortar with European defensive designs, creating walls that resisted both earthquakes and battering rams. Their secret, hiring Syrian masons who understood the region's seismic activity, paying them triple wages to prevent defection to rival projects. This cultural fusion produced some of history's most cost-effective fortresses until political shifts made their maintenance impossible. What emerges from these regional contrasts isn't just a tale of stone and mortar, but of human ingenuity pressed to its limits. A castle in Wales might collapse if built to Venetian specifications, while a Hungarian fortress's heating system would be useless in Sicily's heat. The greatest builders weren't those with the deepest coffers, but those who listened to the land itself and understood that every geographic advantage came with its own hidden invoice. Rome wasn't built in a day, but Windsor Castle's construction made even ancient Rome's timeline look hasty. Stretching across 3 centuries, its walls rose and fell with the fortunes of English kings, each generation inheriting a half-finished project and a mountain of debt. This wasn't architecture, it was a relay race where the baton was a bottomless purse of gold. Weather alone could derail progress for years. Accounts from 1422 describe how relentless rains turned Caernarfon Castle's foundation trenches into quagmires, drowning oxen and rotting timber scaffolds. Workers would return each spring to find their previous year's labor swallowed by mud, resetting the clock on completion. War played its own cruel game with timelines. When Edward III diverted funds from Windsor to finance his French campaigns, the castle's half-built tower stood skeletal for 40 years, its exposed mortar crumbling under frost. Similar interruptions plagued continental projects. The Hohenzollern family's fortress in Swabia saw construction halted 7 times across 200 years due to dynastic squabbles, each restart requiring expensive surveys to assess decay. The true cost of these delays wasn't just measured in idle workers, it was in the compounded interest of borrowed money. Venetian bankers charged up to 30% annual interest on loans to the Dukes of Milan for their castle projects, turning what began as manageable debt into financial traps. What's often overlooked is the human toll of these endless projects. Stonemasons at Berg Hohenstaufen signed lifetime contracts, knowing they'd likely die before seeing their work completed. Their children would inherit both their tools and their debts, as wages were often deferred until key phases finished, phases that might never come. At Spain's Alhambra, whose 2-century evolution birthed architectural marvels like the Court of Lions, craftsmen's graffiti tells a darker story. One inscription reads, "I carved these leaves for a sultan I never met, under a master who died yesterday." The most insidious effect of prolonged construction was the shifting goalposts of design. What began as a simple keep at Pyriphons mushroomed into a lavish palace as successive owners tacked on new wings, each change order inflating costs. France's Château de Vincennes provides the ultimate cautionary tale. Its donjon took 55 years to complete, only for Charles V to demand thicker walls after seeing new siege technology, effectively condemning workers to another lifetime of labor. These weren't just buildings, they were financial black holes where ambition outpaced reality, swallowing generations of wealth and sweat in their endless pursuit of perfection. Yet perhaps the greatest irony lies in the castles that outlasted their purpose. By the time Germany's Frankenstein castle was finally completed in the 16th century, gunpowder had made its towering walls obsolete. Its builders might as well have carved their names into the wind. Their life's work was a monument to an age already slipping into legend. The stones still stand today, not as testaments to triumph, but as silent witnesses to the most dangerous delusion of all. That time is a resource as infinite as a king's ego. Maintaining a castle was like trying to hold back the tide. No matter how sturdy the walls seemed, decay was always one step behind. Take Dover Castle's Great Hall, where records from the 14th century show carpenters replacing rotten beams every 3 years, each repair costing more than a knight's annual salary. And it wasn't just wood that betrayed its builders. Mortar, that seemingly humble mix of lime and sand, had a sneaky habit of dissolving under relentless rain, forcing masons into endless cycles of repointing. At Kenilworth Castle, the Earl's steward noted with despair how winter frosts would gnaw at the walls like a starving dog, leaving gaps wide enough to fit a dagger by spring. The true financial horror lay in the specialized labor these repairs demanded. Unlike construction, where unskilled peasants could haul stones, maintenance required master craftsmen who commanded premium wages. Windsor Castle's accounts reveal a single master roofer earning twice what the castle's chaplain did, proof that in the medieval world, keeping water out was more valuable than saving souls. Even simple tasks became extravagances. Re-leadering a single window at Caernarfon could consume 30 pounds of expensive lead, while re-roping a well-required hemp imported from the Baltic. Neglect carried consequences far beyond aesthetics. When the Dukes of Brittany skimped on tower repairs at Socinio Castle, the resulting collapse killed 6 guards and left the entire coastal flank undefended. At Chinon, where kings once hosted Joan of Arc, the roof timbers gave way within 50 years of completion, transforming the Great Hall into a rain-filled ruin. These weren't just accidents, they were financial time bombs. The Bishop of Winchester learned this the hard way when his beloved Wolvesey Castle became so drafty that visiting diplomats demanded heated tents in the courtyard rather than endure its icy chambers. Some rulers attempted radical cost-cutting measures with disastrous results. The Count of Flanders famously ordered his workers to patch crumbling walls with a mix of straw and dung, a decision that attracted swarms of rats and collapsed an entire curtain wall during a state banquet. Others, like the Duke of Berry, tried to offset costs by renting out castle spaces to merchants, only to find the vibrations from their looms destabilized the ancient masonry. Even the most meticulous maintenance couldn't outpace innovation. When gunpowder arrived, castles like Nadjak in France faced the cruel choice of bankrupting themselves with costly earthwork reinforcements or becoming obsolete. What emerges from these crumbling ledgers is a paradox. The very symbols of permanence were locked in a losing battle against time. Every repaired leak meant one less coin for armies. Every reforged hinge came at the cost of a peasant's tax relief. In the end, many castles weren't conquered by enemies, but by the quiet, relentless arithmetic of entropy, proving that the greatest threat to a fortress wasn't the battering ram outside, but the slow decay within. Dunstanburgh Castle stands today as a haunting lesson in financial hubris. Its crumbling towers never saw a single battle, defeated not by armies but by empty coffers. When the Earl of Lancaster began construction in 1313, He envisioned a masterpiece to rival royal fortresses, but the project quickly became a money pit. Within 5 years, costs had ballooned to over £3,000, nearly double the annual income of England's wealthiest nobles, forcing workers to abandon half-finished walls. The Earl's dream of defiance against the king dissolved into a sprawling ruin, its gatehouse never even receiving doors. What's most telling is the castle's design. Its seaward defenses were unnecessarily extravagant, suggesting the Earl prioritized vanity over strategy, a miscalculation that left his descendants saddled with debt for generations. Poland's Olsztyn Castle tells a similar tale of fiscal overreach. Built to guard against Teutonic knights, its construction dragged on for 60 years as successive rulers siphoned funds to more pressing wars. By the time its towers were complete, military technology had advanced beyond its design, rendering the fortress obsolete. Local ledgers show the final indignity. In 1487, the castle's own garrison was caught stripping lead from the roofs to sell for food, leaving the structure to rot under open skies. These weren't isolated cases across Europe. Castles like France's Cowsey and Scotland's Kildrummie met similar fates, their skeletal remains standing as monuments to budgetary blindness. The death knell for many castles wasn't invasion, but simple neglect. Take Château de la Mothe Chandeliers in France. After surviving centuries of warfare, it was ultimately undone by maintenance costs. Records show its owners spent more on repairing fire damage in 1650 than they did on their own households, yet still couldn't prevent the roof from collapsing 50 years later. The same pattern played out at Spain's Belmont Castle, where the Marquis of Villena prioritized lavish tournaments over structural repairs until rainwater seeped into the foundations and split the keep like overripe fruit. What makes these failures so fascinating is how often they repeated the same mistakes. Builders consistently underestimated ongoing costs like Berg Eltz's need for constant cliff face stabilization, or Malbork's brickwork requiring annual repointing. Others fell victim to shifting priorities. Denmark's Hammersmith Castle was abandoned when its strategic harbor silted up, proving that even the mightiest walls couldn't combat geography. The bitterest irony, many ruins we romanticize today weren't shattered by cannon fire, but by something far more mundane, a ledger's bottom line. These skeletal fortresses whisper a timeless warning that even the grandest ambitions are bound by economic gravity. Their broken walls remind us that in the end, no amount of stone could withstand the weight of poor planning, leaving behind not monuments to glory, but classrooms in the consequences of unchecked ambition. Elena of Aquitaine didn't just inherit castles, she built them with a shrewdness that would make modern financiers blush. While her husband Richard the Lionheart emptied England's treasury for Château Gaillard, Elena bankrolled a network of fortresses across her ancestral lands in Aquitaine, leveraging wine trade revenues to turn rocky outcrops into strategic strongholds. Her most brilliant move, constructing the octagonal keep at Niort not just for defense, but as a customs hub, its walls doubled as warehouses where merchants paid tolls that funded further construction. This wasn't just architecture, it was medieval venture capitalism, with every arrow slit paying dividends. Countess Matilda of Tuscany took a more militarized approach. In 11th century Italy, where papal and imperial factions clashed, she transformed her castles into a messaging system, each fortress within sight of the next, allowing signal fires to relay warnings across the Apennines in hours. But her real innovation was in labor management. Records from Canossa Castle show she paid masons 20% above market rates, attracting the best craftsmen while male rivals relied on forced peasant labor. The result, her walls withstood sieges that crumbled neighboring lords' fortifications, proving that quality trumped brute force. The financial risks these women took were staggering. When Blanche of Castile took over construction at Angers during her son Louis IX's minority, she mortgaged her crown jewels to Venetian bankers, a move that nearly cost her the throne when harvests failed. Yet her gamble paid off. The completed castle became the backbone of Capetian power in the Loire Valley. Similarly, Joan of Navarre financed repairs at Dover Castle by redirecting wool tax revenues, sparking baronial outrage that culminated in her infamous trial for witchcraft, a thinly veiled punishment for financial independence. What made female patrons different wasn't just their funding sources, but their architectural priorities. While men obsessed with siege defense, women like Philippa of Hainault redesigned Windsor's residential quarters with innovative sanitation systems and private chapels. At Olite Castle in Navarre, Queen Elena commissioned heated floors and rooftop gardens, luxuries male builders dismissed until they experienced them firsthand. These weren't frivolous additions, they made castles livable for the first time, transforming them from grim barracks into centers of governance, the ultimate irony. Many women's contributions were erased by later chroniclers. The brilliant water defenses at Chinon, credited to Henry II, were actually designed by his mother Empress Matilda after she observed Moorish irrigation systems. And the famed concentric walls of Beaumaris, Master James of St. George's plans survive, with margin notes in the handwriting of Edward I's queen, Elena of Castile, correcting his troop capacity calculations. These women didn't just build castles, they redefined power itself, proving that the strongest foundations weren't always made of stone. Their legacy lingers in the overlooked details. A drainage system here, a thoughtfully placed window there, whispering that history's greatest fortresses owed as much to a queen's quill as a king's sword. Beneath the soaring arches of Spain's Alhambra or the imposing walls of Constantinople, there's a layer of history rarely mentioned in guidebooks, the fingerprints of those who built these marvels not by choice but by chains. The Moors' stunning Alcazar of Seville, with its intricate arabesques and cooling fountains, was partly shaped by Christian captives forced to quarry stone under the Andalusian sun. Byzantine emperors, meanwhile, marched thousands of enslaved Bulgarians to Constantinople, where they mixed mortar for walls thick enough to deflect Crusaders' siege engines. These weren't just laborers, they were human currency, traded and spent as casually as the silver coins that paid for their tools. Records from the construction of Hungary's Diostia Castle reveal the cold calculus behind this system. King Louis the Great saved nearly 40% on labor costs by using captured Serbian soldiers instead of paid masons, a calculation meticulously recorded in his ledgers alongside expenses for rope and nails. But the true horror lies in the details. Work quotas were set so high that skeletons excavated from castle sites show spines deformed by the constant weight of stone, while iron shackles found in Welsh castle foundations suggest some workers never left the construction pits alive. Even skilled artisans weren't spared after the siege of Château de Montségur. The victorious French dragged away Cathar stonemasons in ropes to work on royal fortresses, their heresy forgiven only so their hands could build. The psychological toll extended beyond the enslaved. At Krakow's Wall Castle, chronicles describe how local Polish workers refused to eat alongside Tatar prisoners, fearing their bread would be cursed. This division became a tool of control. Rulers pitted forced laborers against paid workers, ensuring neither group would unite in rebellion. The strategy worked brutally well. During the building of Portugal's Castle of the Moors, a revolt by Moroccan captives was betrayed by hungry local laborers hoping for extra rations. What makes this system especially chilling is how seamlessly it blended with legitimate construction. Most castles weren't built entirely by slaves, but used them for the most lethal tasks, quarrying in dust-choked pits. hauling stones up unstable scaffolding or working the lead smelters that poisoned laborers within months. The Teutonic Knights perfected this hybrid model at Malbork Castle, where paid masons laid bricks during the day while chained prisoners prepared mortar through the night. Account books from Burgundy show lords deliberately timing projects to coincide with military campaigns, knowing fresh captives would soon arrive to replenish those who died. These unmarked graves beneath Europe's greatest castles force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their legendary walls weren't just feats of engineering, but monuments to a moral blindness that spanned continents and faiths. The same Crusader knights who built hospitals for the poor also worked Saracen prisoners to death in Syrian heat. The Moorish architects who pioneered water-cooled palaces thought nothing of chaining Christians in airless tunnels. Today, as we admire these structures, their beauty can't fully mask the echoes of suffering in every stone, a reminder that the price of glory was often paid in stolen lives. The medieval world was far more interconnected than we often imagine, and nowhere is this clearer than in the materials that built Europe's castles. A single fortress might combine Italian marble floors, Baltic timber beams, and Spanish ironwork, a testament to trade routes that stretched across continents. The Hanseatic League, that powerful network of merchant guilds, became the backbone of this medieval globalization, moving stone from Normandy to Prussia and Welsh slate to the courts of Burgundy. But this convenience came at a price. Every transaction added layers of tariffs, bribes, and middlemen's fees, turning what should have been straightforward purchases into financial labyrinths. Take the striking example of Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. Its walls shimmer with stained glass imported from Chartres, Germany, and even the Middle East. Each panel traveled thousands of miles on wagons and barges, passing through dozens of territorial borders where local lords demanded tolls. Records show the glass alone cost more than the wages of all the craftsmen combined, with Venetian merchants acting as middlemen hiking prices by nearly 40%. Similar markups plagued stone shipments. When Henry III ordered Purbeck marble for Westminster, he discovered the cost had tripled by the time it reached London, thanks to opportunistic traders along the Rhine. The real power players in this system weren't kings, but the merchant dynasties who controlled the routes. The Fugger family of Augsburg financed entire castle projects through loans secured against future mining revenues, while the Medici Bank's network ensured Florentine architects could specify materials from anywhere in their known world. Their ledgers reveal astonishing details, like how Scottish oak bound for Krakow was diverted mid-journey to patch a collapsing tower in Bohemia, all brokered through handwritten letters of credit. Yet this globalization had its vulnerabilities. When the Black Death disrupted shipping lanes in the 14th century, half-built castles like Karlstegen in Bohemia stood frozen for years, their Italian marble stranded in Genoa's harbors. Other projects adapted by going local. The Teutonic Knights switched from imported limestone to Baltic brick when trade collapsed, inadvertently sparking a regional architectural revolution. What emerges from these dusty trade records is a paradox. The very networks that made grand castles possible also made them perilously expensive. A single delayed shipment could bankrupt a project, while rival lords might blockade key rivers to strangle a competitor's construction. The stones of Europe's greatest fortresses whisper tales not just of architects and warriors, but of merchants and mule trains, proof that even in the Middle Ages, no castle stood alone. Imagine trying to budget a castle when your treasury might literally melt away. Medieval rulers faced this nightmare daily. Their wealth wasn't stored in banks but in chests of silver coins that could be clipped, debased, or even vanish overnight. When Henry III of England needed funds for Dover Castle's expansion, His clerks didn't just count coins, they weighed them, knowing rampant clipping had reduced their value by half. This was an economy where a bag of silver pennies might buy a wagon load of stone one season and barely cover a cartload the next, all because a distant famine or war had scrambled the value of precious metals. The Black Death turned this instability into catastrophe, as the plague wiped out a third of Europe's population in the 14th century. Surviving laborers suddenly could demand higher wages appending centuries of feudal cost structures. At Château de Vincennes, records show stonemasons paid tripling overnight, while the price of Baltic timber soared when fewer ox teams remained to haul it. Lords desperate to finish projects resorted to wild improvisation. The Count of Flanders paid his quarrymen in salt, a commodity more stable than coin, while the Duke of Berry famously traded relic fragments from his chapel to Venetian merchants for glass windows. Barter became as crucial as bullion. The construction of Malbork Castle saw the Teutonic Knights swapping amber deposits for iron fittings, while Welsh princes financed Caernarfon's walls with promises of future sheep wool deliveries. Some deals bordered on the absurd. The Bishop of Winchester's ledger lists a 2-ton shipment of cheese accepted as partial payment for a new gatehouse. These patchwork solutions masked a deeper vulnerability. Without standardized currency, every transaction was a gamble. A French lord might agree to pay a master builder in grain, only to find a poor harvest rendered his debt unpayable, leaving half-built towers draped in rotting scaffolding. The most destructive force wasn't scarcity but inflation. When silver mines in Bohemia flooded in the 1350s, the sudden shortage caused prices to spike across Europe. Builders at Beaumaris Castle watched helplessly as their carefully hoarded coins bought fewer and fewer supplies, forcing them to dilute mortar with sand or reuse cracked stones. Kings weren't immune. Edward III of England famously melted down his own crown jewels to keep work going on the Tower of London, only to see the metal's value plummet when new silver arrived from Spanish mines months later. Financial chaos bred desperate innovations. The Medici family pioneered letters of credit to stabilize castle payments across borders, while Jewish moneylenders in Aragon developed early insurance systems where multiple lords shared risk on major projects. Yet for every success story, there were disasters like Berg Katz in Germany, abandoned when its lord ran out of both coins and things to barter. His final ledger entry reads simply, "Ode to the stonemason, one daughter's hand in marriage." These crumbling financial records reveal a truth more startling than any siege engine's power. The greatest threat to a medieval castle wasn't the enemy at the gates, but the numbers on a ledger that refused to add up. Every stone placed was a bet against chaos, a gamble that silver wouldn't vanish, that plague wouldn't strike, that the fragile web of promises holding the project together wouldn't unravel. In the end, many castles fell not to trebuchets, but to the quiet, relentless arithmetic of an economy learning the hard way how to count the cost of ambition. Every innovation in castle design came with a gamble. Would the added security justify the staggering expense? Take the revolutionary concentric walls of Crac des Chevaliers, where builders didn't just stack stones but calculated angles with near mathematical precision. Each layer of defense demanded exact measurements, outer walls low enough to allow archers on inner walls clear shots, yet high enough to slow attackers. The cost skilled engineers imported from Italy paid in silver by the ounce, while local laborers worked double shifts to meet the unforgiving geometry. One surviving ledger from the Hospitallers shows they spent more on surveying tools for this project than on weapons for their entire garrison that year. Then there were the murder holes, those sinister gaps in ceilings where defenders could rain down boiling oil or arrows. What seemed like a simple feature actually required reinforced vaulting to support the weight of soldiers clustered above, plus drainage systems to prevent corrosive liquids from eating through the floor. At Chateau Gaylord, Richard the Lionheart's engineers discovered this the hard way when their hastily built murder holes collapsed under the stampede of defenders during a siege, costing more lives than they saved. Drawbridges epitomized this balance of innovation and expense. A simple wooden ramp might suffice for minor forts, but grand castles needed counterweight systems with iron chains so massive they required their own foundries. The bridge at Caerphilly Castle used oak beams reinforced with imported Baltic iron, materials so costly that when the mechanism jammed in 1282, repairs consumed half the annual maintenance budget. Some lords, like the Duke of Brittany, opted for cheaper fixed bridges, only to watch invaders burn them with alarming regularity. The most telling examples come from failed experiments. At Castell Coch in Wales, an ambitious attempt to build retractable stairs, a sort of medieval elevator, ended with the mechanism crushing 3 workers during testing. The ruined mechanism was left embedded in the walls as a grim reminder of overreach. Similarly, the Count of Flanders' attempt to install Greek fire projectors at his seaside fortress backfired literally when a misfire ignited his own granaries. What emerges from these accounts isn't just a story of technological triumph, but of trial and error paid for in blood and treasure. Each surviving innovation, the angled bastions that deflected cannon fire, the spiral staircases coiled to favor right-handed defenders, represented countless discarded ideas and emptied coffers. The true marvel isn't that medieval builders achieved so much, but that they dared to fail so expensively in pursuit of safety. Their legacy lives on in every castle that still stands, its walls whispering of risks taken and prices paid in the relentless pursuit of an edge against destruction. Castles didn't just consume wealth, they became accidental engines of economic transformation, reshaping the medieval landscape in ways their builders never intended. Take the bustling markets that sprang up outside Carcassonne's walls, where what began as a few stalls selling nails and bread to workers evolved into a permanent trading hub. Within decades, this ad hoc marketplace was drawing merchants from as far as Genoa and Bruges, its cobbled streets lined with guild houses for masons, armorers, and glassmakers who'd followed the construction work. The castle's insatiable demand for supplies birthed entire industries. Local quarries expanded to meet the stone orders, while nearby forests were managed like crops to ensure steady timber harvests. Even the castle's waste fueled growth, with discarded mortar scraps being ground down by enterprising peasants to resell as cheap building material. Yet this economic stimulus came with brutal trade-offs. Rothenburg's story reveals the darker side of castle economics. When its bishop imposed steep construction taxes in the 13th century, farmers were forced to sell their seed grain to pay levies, triggering a cycle of poor harvests and declining trade. The very walls meant to protect the town strangled its growth. Merchants bypassed Rothenburg to avoid the bishop's tolls, while artisans fled to cities without crushing feudal obligations. Archaeological evidence shows Rothenburg's market square shrinking during peak construction years, its wells filled with debris from abandoned stalls. The most fascinating cases show both effects simultaneously. York's Clifford Castle became a magnet for luxury trades. Illuminators, goldsmiths, and wine importers clustered near its gates to serve the nobility, while villages just 20 miles away starved under the weight of its material demands. Tax records reveal peasants in the surrounding countryside eating bark bread during the castle's expansion, even as York's urban population swelled with skilled workers enjoying unheard of wages. This paradox defined the medieval economy. Castles could create prosperity and desperation within the same horizon. their influence radiating outward in uneven waves. Transport networks tell their own story of economic reshaping. The reason so many European roads still curve abruptly near old castle sites: they were rerouted centuries ago to deliver supplies, creating permanent detours that outlasted the fortresses themselves. In France, the Loire River's shipping lanes were dredged and straightened specifically to move castle-building materials, inadvertently creating the trade artery that would make the region wealthy long after the castles became obsolete. Similarly, the stone bridges still standing in Welsh towns like Conwy weren't built for public convenience. They were engineering projects to haul slate from distant quarries, later repurposed by grateful merchants. The afterlife of these construction projects holds the ultimate irony. Many castles that drained their region's resources eventually repaid the debt, not through military might, but by becoming economic anchors in peacetime. The Tower of London's armories were converted into secure storage for wool merchants, while Malbork's vast kitchens became a regional grain distribution center. Even failed projects left valuable legacies. The abandoned foundations of Berg Frankenstein were scavenged by nearby villagers, their stones forming the cottages and barns that still dot the countryside today. What emerges from these layers of economic history isn't a simple tale of exploitation or progress, but a complex web of unintended consequences. The same walls that bankrupted lords could birth thriving towns. The same taxes that crushed peasants might fund the roads that later enriched their grandchildren. Castles didn't just dominate the medieval landscape, they sculpted the economic DNA of Europe itself. Their legacy measured not in sieges withstood, but in markets born, trades invented, and lives irrevocably changed. Translating medieval castle costs into modern dollars reveals numbers so staggering they border on fantasy. Take Windsor Castle adjusting its construction expenses for inflation. Historians estimate a contemporary price tag north of $1 billion. That's more than the Burj Khalifa's initial build cost, and Windsor wasn't even the most extravagant project of its era. The labor alone for Mont Saint Michael's tidal island fortress, with its back-breaking logistics and specialized stonework, could rival the payroll for a Manhattan supertower today. Suddenly, those fairy tale spires seem less like architectural feats and more like fiscal insanity carved in stone. Breaking down these costs exposes just how much the world has changed. A single skilled mason at Beaumaris Castle earned about 4 pence daily, roughly $50 in today's money after inflation. But here's the catch: modern union wages for equivalent craftsmanship would exceed $800 per day, not including benefits or safety equipment. Transporting materials reveals even wilder disparities. Hauling a ton of keen limestone from Normandy to Wales cost medieval builders the equivalent of $3,000 in today's currency. Now, with diesel trucks and container ships, it's less than $200. Yet, paradoxically, modern regulations and environmental protections would balloon timelines and expenses in ways medieval rulers never faced. Imagine the impact assessments alone for diverting a river to fill a moat. Some castles defy modern comparison entirely. Malbork's 13 million bricks would require a kiln workforce 10 times larger than any contemporary brickyard employs, while the hand-carved gargoyles of Notre Dame de Paris, a project of similar complexity, took decades even with 19th century tools. And that's before considering the human cost. No insurance company would underwrite a project using 13th century safety standards, where worker deaths were as routine as mortar mixing. The real question isn't whether we could build these castles today, but why anyone would. Modern militaries rendered high walls obsolete centuries ago, and the tourism revenue from sites like Neuschwanstein, a 19th century homage to medieval excess, rarely covers maintenance, let alone construction. Yet there's a telling exception. Luxury developments like Dubai's artificial islands or Las Vegas's castle-themed casinos prove the allure persists. They're the spiritual successors to Mont Saint, Mitchell, or Piriforms, built not for defense but for status proof that while our tools have changed, our appetite for monumental vanity remains as insatiable as any medieval king's. Perhaps the most revealing comparison lies in what we choose to preserve. The millions spent annually propping up crumbling towers like Tintagel or Kenilworth aren't maintenance bills. They're ransom payments to history, our admission that these follies still hold power over us. In that sense, the castles won. Their builders may have bankrupted kingdoms, but they bought immortality stone by stone. Edinburgh Castle's famous 1 o'clock gun fires daily, a tradition preserved at a cost of nearly £100,000 a year just for the ceremonial artillery. That single expense hints at the staggering sums required to keep history from crumbling. Every stone repointed on its battlements, every antique tapestry restored, adds another line item to a ledger that never closes. The castle soaks up over £4 million annually in maintenance alone, a figure that would make medieval kings blanch. Yet this is just one fortress among thousands across Europe, each with its own financial demands gnawing at modern budgets. The choices facing preservationists today mirror those of medieval stewards: just replace crumbling mortar or rebuild entirely. At Wales' Conwy Castle, engineers discovered the Victorian-era restorations were actually accelerating decay, their cement-based mortar trapping moisture inside ancient stones. The repair bill for this well-intentioned mistake topped £8 million, sparking debates about whether some interventions cause more harm than neglect. Meanwhile, France's Château de la Marthe chandeliers took a different path, partially stabilized as a romantic ruin. Its collapsed towers left open to the sky while quay walls were reinforced with titanium rods. This compromise cut costs by 60% while preserving the site's haunting beauty. Climate change adds another layer of financial strain. Rising groundwater at Malbork Castle threatens its famous brick foundations, requiring a €12 million drainage system that medieval builders never envisioned. Venice's historic forts now battle corrosive saltwater with every high tide, their restoration budgets ballooning as fast as the Adriatic rises. Even seemingly solid castles like Germany's else face new threats. Warmer winters allow destructive mosses to thrive in masonry cracks, forcing conservators into endless cycles of cleaning. The human cost of preservation often goes unnoticed. Skilled stonemasons capable of matching medieval techniques are vanishingly rare, their expertise commanding salaries rivaling corporate lawyers. At Carcassonne's massive restoration project, craftsmen trained for 7 years just to master the local sandstone's quirks. Their knowledge dies with them unless painstakingly documented. One reason Scotland's heritage agencies now laser scan entire castles before repairs begin, creating digital blueprints for future generations. Some communities embrace radical solutions to keep their history alive. Belgium's Gravenstein Castle struck a deal with a beer company to fund repairs in exchange for hosting medieval-themed events, controversial but effective. Portugal's Panedo Castle transformed its dungeons into a luxury hotel, with room rates subsidizing preservation. Even abandoned ruins find new purpose. The skeletal remains of Dunstanburgh Castle on England's coast now serve as an accidental wildlife sanctuary, their crumbling walls sheltering rare birds more affordably than any museum display. The bitter irony: many castles survived centuries of warfare only to face existential threats from spreadsheets. Edinburgh's City Council recently calculated that maintaining the castle's current state for another 50 years would cost more than building 10 new hospitals. Yet when officials proposed scaling back repairs, public outcry forced a reversal proof that these stones still hold power over our collective imagination. Perhaps the true measure of a castle's worth isn't in its balance sheets, but in its ability to make us pause mid-stride, looking up at walls that whisper across 800 years, reminding us what endures when ambition meets craftsmanship, and who pays the price to keep that conversation alive. The towering cranes over a half-built Olympic stadium or the spiraling budgets of a high-speed rail project might seem like modern headaches, but their roots stretch back to medieval quarry pits and half-finished castle walls. The same financial traps that ensnared kings' optimistic timelines, underestimated labor costs, and the irresistible urge to add just one more lavish feature still plague today's mega-projects. Consider Berlin's Brandenburg Airport, delayed by 14 years and over €4 billion over budget. Its woes mirror Edward I's struggles with Caernarfon Castle, where the original 3-year timeline stretched into decades as Welsh rebellions and silver shortages derailed progress. The through line, a dangerous cocktail of political pressure and unchecked ambition, where admitting failure becomes more costly than throwing good money after bad. Modern labor practices might seem worlds apart from feudal corvée systems, but the exploitation of transient or marginalized workers remains a stubborn constant. The migrant crews building Qatar's World Cup stadiums faced conditions medieval masons would recognize: confiscated passports, wage theft, and perilous work sites hidden behind glittering facades. Just as Elena of Aquitaine relied on Aquitaine's wine trade to fund her castles, today's developers lean on speculative real estate deals and naming rights to offset costs, creating house of card financial structures. When London's Millennium Dome needed bailouts after sponsors pulled out, it echoed the Bishop of Winchester's desperate sale of church relics to finish Wolvesey Castle's crumbling towers. The most telling parallel lies in how both eras weaponized spectacle to justify excess. Medieval lords hosted tournaments in unfinished courtyards to distract from construction delays, much like cities today rush to inaugurate stadiums with half-painted seats before elections. Dubai's Burj Khalifa, while a marvel of engineering, shares DNA with Neuschwanstein Castle, both statement projects that prioritized symbolism over practicality, their budgets ballooning as planners chased ever grander visions. The difference: where castles bankrupted individual nobles, modern megaprojects socialize risk, leaving taxpayers to foot the bill long after the ribbon-cutting confetti settles. Yet history offers glimmers of hope. Just as Matilda of Tuscany's fair wages produced sturdier walls, Germany's Energiewende renewable energy transition shows how investing in skilled, unionized labor yields better long-term outcomes than cut-rate contracts. And where medieval kings hoarded materials, Amsterdam's circular economy approached recycling stadium seating and modular construction, echoes the Teutonic Knights' pragmatic brick reuse at Malbork. The lesson isn't that we're doomed to repeat the past, but that the solutions have been there all along, buried in the ledgers of those rare projects that balanced ambition with humility. The real innovation would be finally reading them. As we lower the drawbridge on this journey, remember, Europe's castles are more than stone. They're ledgers of human effort, ambition, and sacrifice. Their true cost wasn't just in gold, but in lifetimes spent hauling, carving, and fighting. Next time you see a castle, think of the invisible price tag and the stories etched into every wall. If this exploration intrigued you, share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden economies. Standing before these ancient walls today, it's easy to marvel at their grandeur without seeing the fractures, the cracks where greed outpaced practicality, where vanity drowned out compassion. But look closer, and you'll find the fingerprints of those who paid the highest price. the quarryman who never saw his children grow, the mason who signed his work with a chisel mark because history wouldn't record his name, the peasant who starved while her lord's towers scraped the sky. These castles weren't just built, they were bought with a currency no treasury could mint, the weight of thousands of ordinary lives bent beneath extraordinary ambition. Yet there's a quiet defiance in these stones too. For every king who bankrupted his kingdom, there's a Matilda of Tuscany proving fair wages built sturdier walls. For every vanity project like Pyrophon's, there's a Malbork castle where innovation turned scarcity into strength. The lesson isn't that ambition itself was folly, but that its true measure lies in who bears the cost and who reaps the reward. So let's not romanticize these fortresses as mere fairy tale backdrops, nor dismiss them as relics of oppression. They're both and neither. They're mirrors reflecting our own world's triumphs and failures, where megaprojects still balloon past budgets, where workers' hands still shape monuments to others' glory. The difference is we get to choose what we see in that reflection. Will we notice only the soaring towers, or will we trace the mortar lines back to the lives that mixed it? The next time you walk through a castle gate, pause where the sunlight slants through an arrow slit. That beam illuminates more than dust, it's a spotlight on 8 centuries of human ingenuity, suffering, and resilience. These walls don't just keep history contained, they let it breathe, whispering across the ages that greatness is never as simple as it seems. And if we're willing to listen, they might just teach us how to build a future worthy of their sacrifices. Your turn now. Which castle story surprised you most? Drop your thoughts below, and let's keep unraveling history's tangled threads together. For more journeys into the past's hidden corners, hit subscribe and ring that notification bell. Until next time, remember, every stone has a story. All we have to do is listen.